The sun had just begun to rise over the small town of Clearbrook, casting a soft golden glow on its quiet streets. Nestled between rolling hills and dense woodlands, Clearbrook was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other by name, and life moved at a gentle, steady pace. The town's main street, lined with old-fashioned lampposts and locally owned shops, felt untouched by time, a place where traditions were honored, and neighbors were more like family. In the heart of this town lived Martha Jenkins, a 72-year-old widow, known to everyone as the town's beloved grandmother. Martha had lived in Clearbrook her entire life. A figure of quiet strength, she had raised her family here, worked at the local school as a lunch lady for decades, and continued to volunteer at the church even in her old age. Her gentle smile and unwavering kindness had earned her the affection and respect of the entire community. She wasn't just any elderly woman. Martha was someone everyone in town looked up to, a symbol of resilience who had seen the town through good times and bad. Her son, Daniel Jenkins, lived a few miles down the road in a modest house with his wife and 2 children. Daniel was the type of man who preferred to keep to himself, spending most of his days working in his garage repairing cars. Despite his quiet demeanor, he was fiercely protective of his mother, especially after his father's passing a few years earlier. Daniel wasn't the type to make waves, but those who knew him well understood that beneath his calm exterior was a man of deep convictions, always willing to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. It was a Saturday morning, and Martha, like clockwork, was getting ready for her weekly grocery trip. She slipped on her well-worn cardigan, the one she always wore on cool mornings, and grabbed her purse from the hook by the door. The air outside was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from her garden as she made her way down the front steps of her small but charming home. As she drove her old sedan through the sleepy streets of Clearbrook, Martha waved to the familiar faces she passed. There was Mrs. Abbott, watering her roses, and Mr. Frank, the mailman, doing his usual route. Everything was as it always was, peaceful, predictable. Life in Clearbrook didn't often come with surprises, and that was just the way Martha liked it. She arrived at Hank's Market, the town's only grocery store, a place she had been shopping at for as long as she could remember. Hank, the owner, was an old friend of Martha's, and his store felt like a second home to her. As she stepped inside, the warm smell of freshly baked bread greeted her. Hank waved from behind the counter, a big grin on his face. "Morning, Martha," he called out, adjusting his glasses. "Morning, Hank. Beautiful day, isn't it?" she replied with a smile. She grabbed a cart and began her usual route through the aisles, chatting with the other shoppers as she went. It was the kind of town where people took their time with everything, especially conversations. After about half an hour of leisurely shopping, Martha headed toward the checkout counter, exchanging pleasantries with the cashier. She carefully placed her bags in her cart and made her way to the parking lot, pushing the cart slowly toward her car. As Martha reached her car and began loading her groceries into the trunk, she noticed a police car pull into the parking lot. She paid little attention at first, assuming the officer was there for a routine patrol. However, as she finished placing the last bag in the trunk and went to return her cart, she heard a voice call out sharply behind her. "Ma'am, hold on a second." Martha turned around, startled to see the officer, a man she didn't recognize, walking briskly toward her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and clean. His face was stern, and his eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, gave him an air of authority that seemed out of place in the usually friendly town of Clearbrook. This was Officer Craig, the new cop who had recently transferred to the town's police department. "Is there something wrong, officer?" Martha asked politely, a hint of confusion in her voice. "You can't park here, ma'am. This is a no-parking zone," Officer Craig said, his voice cold and clipped. Martha blinked in surprise. She had parked in the same spot for years, just a few steps from the store's entrance. There was no sign indicating it was a restricted area, and she pointed this out to him. "Officer, I don't think that's correct. I've parked here every Saturday for years without any trouble. There's no sign. Are you arguing with me? Officer Craig interrupted, his tone becoming sharper. His hand rested on his belt, where his baton and handcuffs hung, as if he was ready to escalate the situation. I suggest you move your vehicle now before I issue a citation. Martha, flustered but still trying to remain calm, nodded. Of course, I'll move it, but I really don't understand. Ma'am, I don't care if you've been parking here for 100 years. You're in violation, and I don't have time to argue with you. Officer Craig snapped, raising his voice enough to attract the attention of nearby shoppers. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she fumbled for her keys, trying to avoid further confrontation. She had always been respectful of authority, and never had any problems with the law. The officer's aggressive attitude was unnerving, and she felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck as people started to watch the exchange. Look, I'm just doing my job, Officer Craig continued, his voice filled with condescension. It doesn't matter how long you've been around here. You're breaking the law, and it's people like you who think they're above the rules. At that moment, the implication of his words hit Martha hard. She wasn't imagining it. There was something else behind his hostility. The officer's demeanor, the way he looked at her with thinly veiled disdain, made her feel small and powerless. She could sense the racial bias bubbling just beneath the surface of his words. I didn't mean any trouble, Martha said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the officer's escalating tirade. But Officer Craig wasn't done. He stepped closer, his face only inches from hers now. If I were you, ma'am, I'd start respecting the badge. You people think you can do whatever you want. But not in this town, not while I'm on duty. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy with unspoken meaning. The bystanders, some whom knew Martha well, watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. Martha's heart raced as she clutched her keys tighter, feeling utterly humiliated. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. Just as Martha opened the car door, trying to hide the tears of frustration welling up in her eyes, she heard someone call out from across the parking lot. It was her son, Daniel, walking toward them with a concerned look on his face. He had seen the commotion from down the street, and his protective instincts had kicked in immediately. Is there a problem here? Daniel's voice was calm but firm as he approached. Officer Craig turned his gaze toward Daniel, his expression unchanged. This doesn't concern you, sir. Your mother was parked illegally, and I'm handling it. Daniel looked at his mother, then back at the officer, his face hardening as he realized what was happening. That spot's never been marked as illegal, officer. You can check with the store owner. Officer Craig sneered, clearly not appreciating the challenge to his authority. Sir, I suggest you step back before you make things worse. This is official business. The tension between the three grew palpable, and for a moment, it seemed as though the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. And this was just the beginning. The atmosphere in the parking lot shifted dramatically as Officer Craig continued to tower over Martha, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. The small crowd that had gathered stood still, their eyes wide with shock, but their feet seemingly rooted to the spot. Nobody moved to intervene. The casual morning buzz of people loading groceries into their cars and exchanging pleasantries had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the officer's escalating tirade. Do you even understand what I'm telling you? Officer Craig spat, his face reddening with each word. You've been breaking the law, and now you're refusing to cooperate. This is how things get worse for people like you. Martha stood there, her body rigid and tense, trying to keep her composure. Her heart raced beneath the weight of his words, the shame and fear swirling together inside her. She had never felt so small in her life. The words, people like you, hung in the air like a poisoned dart, sharp and intentional. The humiliation of being targeted, of being singled out not for her actions, but for who she was, stung her deeply. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, Martha said quietly, her voice shaking. I'll move the car right now. But Officer Craig wasn't listening. He was too far gone, too wrapped up in the performance of his authority, his chest puffed up with the power he wielded. And now, with people watching, he seemed intent on making an example out of her. "No, you won't just move the car," he barked, his voice growing louder. "You're going to stand there and wait until I've written you a citation for disorderly conduct." The words hit Martha like a blow. Disorderly conduct. She had done nothing wrong. She had tried to be respectful, to comply with his demands. The indignity of it all overwhelmed her. She felt her knees tremble, her legs weak beneath her. All around her, people were watching, but nobody dared speak up. A few exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to get involved. It was as though they, too, feared becoming targets themselves. Tears welled in Martha's eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to let them fall. She wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She reached into her purse, fumbling for her phone. Her hand shook as she dialed the familiar number. "Daniel, I need you here," she whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible. It's bad." She hung up before he could ask any questions. She knew he would come immediately. He always did. It wasn't long before Daniel's car pulled up into the parking lot, his tires screeching slightly as he parked. He stepped out, moving quickly toward his mother, his face tight with concern. The moment he saw the expression on her face, the helplessness, the fear, something in him shifted. He knew his mother well, and it was rare to see her like this. Martha Jenkins was a strong woman, someone who had faced life's hardest challenges with grace and resilience. But today, she looked fragile, almost broken. "Mom, are you okay?" Daniel asked as he reached her, his voice soft but urgent. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Martha didn't answer right away, her eyes darting between Daniel and Officer Craig. The officer stood there, arms crossed, his posture rigid. The moment he saw Daniel, his expression hardened even further, if that was possible. "You need to back off, son," Officer Craig said, stepping closer. His tone was menacing, dripping with hostility. "This doesn't concern you." Daniel looked at him, his jaw clenched. He wasn't the type to lose his temper easily, but seeing his mother treated like this tested every bit of his patience. Still, he knew he had to stay calm. If he reacted emotionally, things could get worse, far worse. "It absolutely concerns me," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "This is my mother, and I'm not going to let you bully her like this. What exactly is the problem here?" Officer Craig glared at Daniel, clearly displeased with his defiance. "Your mother is in violation of parking regulations and has been resisting lawful orders. Now she's facing a citation for disorderly conduct. If you don't step aside and let me handle this, you'll be facing charges too." Daniel stared at the officer, his disbelief growing by the second. He knew this was more than just a parking violation. The way the officer was treating his mother wasn't about a minor infraction. It was about power, control, and something more sinister. "My mother didn't resist anything. She offered to move her car," Daniel said, his voice measured but firm. "There's no need for this to escalate." But Officer Craig wasn't backing down. His eyes narrowed as he took another step toward Daniel, the tension between them thickening like the humid air on a stormy day. "I don't need you telling me how to do my job, son," he said coldly. "I'm in charge here, and you're going to stand aside." Daniel felt his hands ball into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that one wrong move could give this officer the excuse he was looking for to turn this into something much worse. Daniel could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he also knew he couldn't just stand by and let this happen. "I'm not here to tell you how to do your job," Daniel said, his voice firm but respectful. "I'm just asking you to treat my mother with the respect she deserves. She's done nothing wrong." Officer Craig's face twisted into a sneer. "Respect? You people think you deserve respect, no matter what you do." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The officer's words hung in the air like a noxious cloud. "You people, The ugly reality of what this was really about became crystal clear. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. He wasn't going to let this man push him into doing something reckless. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, it did. Martha, still shaken by the confrontation, tried to step closer to Daniel, seeking comfort in his presence. But Officer Craig moved faster, grabbing her arm with a roughness that sent a jolt of pain through her frail body. "Get back," the officer barked, yanking Martha's arm. Daniel's entire body tensed as he saw his mother stumble under the officer's grip. For a moment, the world around him seemed to stop. The anger that had been simmering just beneath the surface surged up like a tidal wave, threatening to overwhelm him. But even in that moment, Daniel knew he had to stay calm, for his mother's sake and for his own. "Take your hands off her," Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something harder, something that came from deep within him. Officer Craig's grip tightened, and for a brief second, it looked as though he wasn't going to back down. But the look in Daniel's eyes made him pause. There was something about the quiet intensity of Daniel's words that gave the officer a moment of hesitation. The people in the parking lot, who had remained passive onlookers, now shifted uneasily. The situation had gone too far. Some of them pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Martha winced in pain as Officer Craig's grip remained firm. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of it all. "Please, just let me go." Daniel took a step forward, his eyes locked on the officer. "I said, let her go." The officer's hand twitched, and for a moment, Daniel feared the worst. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, Officer Craig released Martha's arm, pushing her away with a grunt. She stumbled, but Daniel caught her before she fell, his arms steady around her trembling frame. He held her close, his anger still coursing through him, but he kept it in check. This wasn't over yet, and he knew it. The officer stood there, breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger. The crowd was growing, and the situation was no longer in his control. People were recording, and Daniel had made sure not to give him any reason to escalate further. But Daniel also knew that this wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. Daniel's heart raced as he held his mother close, his eyes never leaving Officer Craig. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their whispers swirling around like a low hum of tension in the cool morning air. The situation was on the verge of spiraling out of control. The officer, his chest heaving, seemed unwilling to admit defeat, but Daniel wasn't about to let this man humiliate his mother any further. Something inside him had snapped. He had stayed calm for as long as he could, but now he had to take a stand. Daniel took a deep breath and gently helped Martha stand straight, her arm trembling slightly from the rough treatment she'd just endured. He turned back to face Officer Craig, stepping forward with quiet but unmistakable authority. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Officer," Daniel began, his voice steady but edged with unmistakable resolve. "You've already crossed the line. You put your hands on my mother, and I won't stand for it. Not another step further." There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures. Daniel's voice was calm, controlled, but there was an unmistakable fierceness behind it. He wasn't asking for respect anymore. He was demanding it. Officer Craig flinched ever so slightly, as if realizing that the power he had once held over the situation was slipping through his fingers. "You're interfering with a lawful action," Officer Craig shot back, though his voice didn't carry the same iron confidence it had moments earlier. "If you don't step aside, you'll be facing arrest too." Daniel shook his head, holding his ground. "You're not enforcing the law. You're abusing your authority, and everyone here can see it." The tension in the air thickened. The crowd had grown larger, and people were no longer just passive bystanders. Phones were out, cameras were recording, and murmurs of discontent were spreading through the onlookers. What had started as a minor altercation was quickly becoming something far bigger. The energy in the air shifted again as one by one, people from the community began to step forward. The first to step up was Hank, the grocery store owner, who had known Martha for decades. He walked briskly from the front of the store, wiping his hands on his apron as he approached the scene. His face, usually friendly and warm, was etched with concern. "Officer, that's enough," Hank said firmly, standing beside Daniel. "Martha's been coming here for years. She didn't do anything wrong, and you know it." Officer Craig's eyes flicked toward Hank, clearly not expecting anyone to get involved. "This doesn't concern you, sir. Step back." Hank crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "Actually, it does concern me. This is my property, and you're making a scene over nothing." Before Officer Craig could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Reverend Brooks, the local pastor, had joined the growing group of onlookers. A respected figure in the community, Reverend Brooks was known for his calm demeanor and wisdom. He walked forward slowly, his presence commanding respect. "Officer, I think it's time to de-escalate this situation," Reverend Brooks said gently but firmly. "No harm has been done here, and there's no need for this to continue." For a brief moment, the dynamic shifted. Officer Craig, who had been so sure of his dominance over the situation, seemed to falter. The community was beginning to rally around Martha and Daniel, and it was clear that the crowd's mood had turned sharply against him. Daniel, feeling the support of the crowd behind him, took a step forward. His heart was pounding, but he knew this was a moment where he needed to speak, not just for his mother, but for everyone in the town who had ever been mistreated or marginalized. This wasn't just about Martha anymore. It was about something much larger. "You see what's happening here, don't you?" Daniel said, raising his voice so that the crowd could hear him clearly. His voice was filled with emotion, but it was steady and deliberate. "This isn't about a parking spot. This is about respect. It's about power. My mother didn't do anything wrong, but you're treating her like a criminal because you think you can get away with it." The crowd murmured in agreement, the tension growing thicker with every word Daniel spoke. "We've seen this before, haven't we?" Daniel continued, his voice rising. "We've seen people in positions of power abuse that power because they think no one will stand up to them. Well, not today. Today, we're standing up. We're saying enough is enough." The crowd was fully behind him now, nodding and murmuring their agreement. More people stepped forward, their expressions hardening as they saw the truth in Daniel's words. For too long, people had accepted the status quo. But today, something was different. Daniel's words were igniting something in them, a desire for justice, for fairness, for dignity. Officer Craig, now visibly rattled, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced around, as if hoping for backup, but the crowd's reaction was clear. They weren't on his side. He took a small step back, his bluster fading. Daniel pressed on, his voice filled with the raw emotion of someone who had spent a lifetime watching injustice unfold. "You can't treat people like this anymore. Not in this town. Not anywhere. We won't let you." Just as it seemed like Officer Craig might finally back down, the wail of a second police siren echoed through the parking lot. The crowd turned as another patrol car pulled up, and out stepped Sergeant Harris, Officer Craig's superior. Sergeant Harris was a large, imposing man with a grizzled look, someone who had been with the Clearbrook Police Department for years. As he walked toward the crowd, the tension in the air crackled like electricity. Surely, with the sergeant's arrival, reason would prevail. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath, hoping that Sergeant Harris would put an end to the madness. Officer Craig stood a little straighter, clearly relieved to see his superior. "Sergeant," he called out, his voice laced with urgency. "These people are interfering with a lawful action. I was just trying to do my job, and they're obstructing me." Sergeant Harris stopped in front of Officer Craig, his eyes sweeping over the scene. He took in the crowd, the phones recording everything, and then his gaze settled on Daniel, who was still standing protectively in front of his mother. For a long, excruciating moment, It seemed like Sergeant Harris was going to do the right thing. He looked at Officer Craig, then at Martha, and then back at the crowd. But then, to everyone's shock, he spoke. "Craig's right," Sergeant Harris said, his voice gruff. "You people need to step back and let him do his job." The words hit like a hammer. The crowd gasped, disbelief spreading through them like wildfire. Daniel's jaw tightened as his eyes met Sergeant Harris. He had hoped, prayed, that the sergeant would step in and defuse the situation. But instead, the officer in charge had sided with his subordinate, even after everything that had happened. Martha's eyes filled with fresh tears as she clutched Daniel's arm. The betrayal stung more deeply than anything else. The officer they had trusted to bring reason and calm had just made everything worse. Sergeant Harris turned to the crowd, his expression hardening. "This is a police matter, and you're all interfering with an investigation. If you don't disperse, we'll have to start making arrests." The crowd stirred, a mixture of anger and fear rippling through them. But no one moved. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. People who had known each other for years, who had never seen such a blatant abuse of power in their small town, were now standing on the edge of something dangerous. Daniel's heart sank, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. Not now. "This isn't justice," Daniel said, his voice calm but filled with steel. "And everyone here knows it. You might be able to silence us today, but we're not going to stop. We'll keep standing up, because what you're doing is wrong." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, but they also knew that with the sergeant siding with Officer Craig, the situation was far from over. What had begun as a minor confrontation had now become a full-blown standoff. Sergeant Harris's eyes darkened, but before he could respond, a new voice rang out from the back of the crowd, a voice no one had expected to hear. The parking lot incident didn't fade into the background like so many other small-town altercations. By the time Martha and Daniel returned home that afternoon, the story had already begun to spread, igniting the kind of outrage that would fracture the town of Clearbrook in ways no one had imagined. The moment Daniel closed the door behind them, the weight of what had happened came crashing down on both of them. Martha sank into her favorite chair, her hands still trembling from the shock of it all. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Daniel said softly, sitting beside her. He wanted to fix it, to take away the pain, but he knew the damage had already been done. The sight of Officer Craig grabbing his mother, of her fear and humiliation, replayed in his mind like a nightmare. Martha, her face pale and drawn, shook her head. "It wasn't your fault, Daniel. I never thought something like this could happen here." They sat in silence for a long time, the gravity of the day settling over them like a dark cloud. But this was only the beginning. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of his phone buzzing repeatedly on the kitchen table. He rubbed his eyes and reached for it, only to see a flood of messages and missed calls. His heart sank as he read through them. The incident at the grocery store had exploded across social media. People from the town, and even beyond, were talking about what had happened. Photos and videos of the confrontation had spread, showing Officer Craig's aggressive treatment of Martha and Daniel's defiant stand. The online conversation was heated, with people taking sides and arguing furiously in comment threads. By noon, the local news had picked up the story. A reporter knocked on their door, eager for an interview, but Daniel refused. The last thing his mother needed was more attention. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, the police department would issue a statement or an apology, acknowledging that Officer Craig had overstepped his bounds. But that hope was dashed later that day when Daniel received a letter from the Clearbrook Police Department. The letter stated that a formal investigation had been opened, not into Officer Craig's behavior, but into Martha and Daniel. The charge: disrupting the peace and obstructing police conduct. They were being accused of resisting lawful orders and creating a public disturbance. The words on the paper felt like a slap in the face. Instead of owning up to their mistakes, the police department was doubling down, painting Martha and Daniel as the aggressors. It was an outrageous accusation, and Daniel felt a surge of anger rise within him. But he also knew that this was a calculated move. The police were trying to silence them, to make sure that the story didn't turn into a larger issue of racial bias and abuse of power. When Daniel told his mother about the letter, her face crumpled in disbelief. "How can they do this?" she whispered. "How can they accuse us of anything after what that man did?" Daniel didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they weren't going to take this lying down. As the investigation into Martha and Daniel began, the town of Clearbrook found itself split down the middle. In coffee shops, at church gatherings, and on front porches, people debated the incident with fervor. Some residents, particularly the older ones, stood firmly behind the police, arguing that Officer Craig was just doing his job and that Martha and Daniel had escalated the situation. They didn't believe the accusations of racial bias, brushing them off as exaggerations. "Clearbrook's not that kind of place," one older man said during a town hall meeting. "We've never had these kinds of problems before. This whole thing's been blown out of proportion." But others, especially younger residents and people of color in the community, saw things differently. They recognized the pattern of abuse, the subtle but unmistakable way Officer Craig had treated Martha as less than. They rallied around the Jenkins family, organizing small protests outside the police station and speaking out at town meetings. Local activists began circulating petitions calling for Officer Craig's resignation and demanding that the police department be held accountable for their actions. At one particularly heated town meeting, tensions boiled over. A woman named Angela, who had grown up in Clearbrook but left for college and had recently returned, stood up and spoke. Her voice trembled with emotion as she recounted her own experiences of racial profiling by the police when she was younger. "This isn't new," Angela said, her eyes flashing with anger. "This has been happening for years, but no one ever talks about it because it's easier to pretend it doesn't exist. What happened to Martha could have happened to any one of us, and if we don't do something now, it will happen again." Her words struck a chord with many in the room, but not everyone was convinced. Voices were raised, accusations were hurled, and by the end of the night, it was clear that the town was more divided than ever. As the community continued to grapple with the fallout, the story caught the attention of regional news outlets. Soon, reporters from larger cities arrived in Clearbrook, eager to cover the growing controversy. News vans lined the streets near the police station, and cameras flashed as journalists tried to get interviews with anyone who had witnessed the incident. The media attention put immense pressure on both the Jenkins family and the police department. The police chief, Chief Turner, held a press conference, standing stiffly in front of a wall of microphones as he defended his officers. "We believe in upholding the law and maintaining public order," Chief Turner said, his voice cold and formal. "While we are conducting a thorough investigation, I want to remind everyone that no one is above the law, and disrupting police operations is a serious offense." But the public wasn't buying it. The video evidence was too damning. National news channels began running segments on the story, with commentators debating whether this was yet another case of police overreach and racial discrimination. The footage of Officer Craig grabbing Martha had gone viral, and hashtags calling for justice spread across social media platforms. With the increased attention came more scrutiny. Activists from outside Clearbrook began showing up to support Martha and Daniel, holding signs that read "Justice for Martha" and "Stop Police Brutality." The situation had grown far beyond a small-town dispute. It was now a symbol of the larger national conversation about race, policing, and accountability. While the public attention grew, the personal toll on Martha and Daniel became harder to bear. Martha, once a woman who was known for her warmth and presence in the community, now found herself paralyzed with fear. She rarely left her house, too afraid of running into people who might side with the police or those who looked at her with pity. Every time she thought about that day, about the way Officer Craig had grabbed her arm, her heart raced, and her chest tightened. "I feel like a prisoner in my own home," she confessed to Daniel one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to move forward from this." Daniel, too, was struggling. While he had become the face of the resistance against the police's abuse of power, it came at a cost. His phone rang constantly, calls from reporters, activists, and even strangers offering their support. But it also brought threats. Anonymous messages appeared in his inbox, warning him to back off and stop stirring up trouble. His car had been keyed twice, and he began to notice the same police cruiser driving slowly past his house at night. The pressure was immense. He felt as though he was standing on a precipice, trying to balance the responsibility of fighting for justice with the need to protect his family. His children, once carefree and happy, had grown quiet and anxious, sensing the tension that filled the air. But Daniel refused to back down. He knew that this was bigger than him, bigger than his mother. The fight for justice had to continue, no matter the cost. With the town divided, the media watching, and the personal toll mounting, the stakes had never been higher. The incident that had begun as a routine grocery store trip had transformed into a battle for the soul of Clearbrook, a battle that was far from over. The decision to file a lawsuit against the Clearbrook Police Department was not one that Daniel took lightly. He knew it would put him and his mother in the crosshairs of even more scrutiny, but he also knew it was the only way to seek justice. After days of deliberation and conversations with family and close friends, Daniel contacted Elaine Carter, a renowned civil rights attorney from the nearby city of Fairview, to represent them in what was quickly becoming the most controversial case Clearbrook had ever seen. Elaine was known for her sharp legal mind and her fearlessness in taking on powerful institutions. When she arrived in town to meet with Daniel and Martha, her confidence and warmth were a welcome change from the oppressive tension that had settled over their lives. Sitting at the dining room table of the Jenkins' modest home, she listened intently as Daniel and Martha recounted every detail of that fateful day. "They think they can intimidate you into silence," Elaine said, her voice calm but firm. "But we're going to show them that they're wrong. This lawsuit isn't just about what happened to you, Martha. It's about exposing the pattern of abuse that's been going on for far too long." Daniel nodded. "We're ready for whatever comes next." What came next was a legal battle unlike anything they could have imagined. Elaine wasted no time filing a formal lawsuit against the Clearbrook Police Department, charging Officer Craig with assault, racial discrimination, and abuse of power. The suit also implicated the department's leadership, including Sergeant Harris and Chief Turner, accusing them of failing to properly discipline officers and allowing a culture of bias and intimidation to flourish. As soon as the lawsuit was announced, the town erupted into a new level of controversy. The local news was filled with headlines about the case, and national outlets continued to cover the story. The police department, predictably, pushed back hard. They issued statements defending Officer Craig's actions, painting Daniel and Martha as agitators who had escalated the situation. Behind the scenes, the department began using every legal tactic in the book to discredit them. Old parking tickets, any minor infraction they could dig up from the past, were suddenly brought into question. They even started spreading rumors. Whispered conversations in town claimed that Daniel had a history of troublemaking, that Martha had always been difficult. These lies were designed to poison public perception and undermine their credibility. The police department's lawyers launched an aggressive defense, filing countersuits and dragging out the legal process in the hope that Daniel and Martha would be worn down. But they weren't. Each court appearance was grueling. Martha, already emotionally exhausted, found it difficult to sit in the courtroom and hear herself portrayed as a nuisance, a woman who had disrespected law enforcement. The stress took its toll on her health. Her blood pressure spiked, and she began losing weight, her once steady hands now shaking with the strain. Daniel, too, felt the weight of the fight bearing down on him. He was painted as the town's villain by certain groups, with whispers of betrayal by those he had known all his life. Some neighbors stopped speaking to him. The local mechanic he had done business with for years suddenly refused to work on his car. The isolation was palpable. But the hardest part wasn't the legal challenges. It was watching his mother suffer. Clearbrook, once a peaceful town where disagreements were mild and forgotten within days, was now a community torn apart. The lawsuit became the focal point of every conversation. In churches, families sat on opposite sides of the pews, their whispered arguments barely contained. Dinner tables became battlegrounds as fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, disagreed on what had happened and who was in the right. Long-standing friendships dissolved overnight. People who had once shared everything from backyard barbecues to holiday dinners now found themselves on opposing sides of the issue. The tension, which had always been present beneath the surface, now erupted into open hostility. Clearbrook's racial divisions, ones that had long been politely ignored or downplayed, were now exposed for everyone to see. At a town hall meeting, emotions boiled over when one local business owner stood up and angrily declared, "This lawsuit is tearing us apart. This isn't about race. It's about law and order. People need to learn to respect authority." In response, a young black woman named Jada, who had grown up in Clearbrook and experienced her own run-ins with the police, stood and spoke from the back of the room. "No," Jada said, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. "This is exactly about race. It's about how we've been treated differently for as long as I can remember. What happened to Martha isn't new. It's just the first time someone had the courage to fight back." The room fell silent, but the lines had been drawn. Clearbrook was no longer the united town it had once been. Just when things seemed darkest for Daniel and Martha, a surprising twist occurred that would change the course of the trial. A few weeks into the legal proceedings, John Miller, a retired police officer who had served in Clearbrook for over 30 years, reached out to Elaine Carter's office. When Daniel and Elaine met with him in her office, John was visibly nervous, wringing his hands as he sat across from them. "I've been watching what's happening," John said quietly, "and I can't stay silent anymore." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, John?" John took a deep breath, his voice thick with regret. "I was on the force for years, and I saw things I didn't say anything about because I didn't want to lose my job. I saw how certain officers treated people like Martha. I saw how some of us, myself included, let our biases get the better of us." Daniel sat forward, his heart pounding. "You're saying this isn't just about Officer Craig?" John nodded slowly. "There's been a culture of bias in that department for years, and I have records. I kept copies of incident reports that were swept under the rug, complaints that were never followed up on. They always protected their own." His revelation hit Daniel like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just about one bad officer. This was about a system that had been broken for a long time. John's testimony, combined with the evidence he provided, was a game changer. Elaine quickly moved to add him as a key witness in the case. When John took the stand during the trial, his testimony was explosive. He detailed how officers had been trained to control the narrative in situations involving people of color, how complaints of racial profiling were routinely ignored, and how Officer Craig had been involved in multiple incidents that had mysteriously disappeared from his record. The courtroom was stunned. John's bravery turned the tide. The public now saw the lawsuit not just as a personal vendetta, but as an exposure of systemic corruption and racism within the Clearbrook Police Department. As the trial dragged on, the emotional strain on Daniel and Martha grew unbearable. Daniel's once quiet life was now filled with the endless stress of court appearances, media attention, and the whispers of townsfolk who still viewed him with suspicion. His reputation, once untarnished, had been dragged through the mud by the police department's smear campaign. But the hardest part was seeing his mother deteriorate before his eyes. Martha had always been the strongest person Daniel knew, but the stress had taken its toll. Her health continued to worsen, and Daniel found himself worrying constantly about her well-being. She rarely left the house anymore, too afraid to face the outside world. "Mama, we're going to get through this," Daniel reassured her one evening, sitting beside her as she lay in bed, her face pale and drawn. Martha smiled weakly, reaching for his hand. I know we will. But Daniel, whatever happens, I'm proud of you. You've fought for what's right. You've done what few people have the courage to do." Daniel swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I just want you to be okay, Mama. That's all that matters to me." Despite the toll it had taken on them both, neither of them considered backing down. The fight had become about more than just clearing their names. It was about justice for everyone in Clearbrook who had suffered in silence. And with John Miller's testimony, they finally had a chance to make real change. The lawsuit was far from over, and the battle was still uphill. But for the first time in months, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. They weren't alone in this fight. The truth was coming to light, and the system that had tried to silence them was finally being exposed for what it was. But the fight for justice, as they were about to discover, was far from over. Months of grueling court battles, community tension, and personal strife culminated in a day that would forever change the lives of Martha, Daniel, and the entire town of Clearbrook. The courtroom was packed, reporters lined the back, and the town's residents filled every available seat. People leaned in, holding their breath as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. In the matter of Jenkins versus the Clearbrook Police Department, the court finds in favor of the plaintiffs, Martha and Daniel Jenkins. The words rang out like a bell, signaling a major victory not only for Martha and Daniel, but for all those in Clearbrook who had silently endured years of unfair treatment and discrimination. The courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs, with tears in Martha's eyes as she clutched Daniel's hand. They had won. Justice had prevailed. The ruling was a landmark decision. Officer Craig was dismissed from the force with immediate effect. But that wasn't the end of it. The court had also ordered a full investigation into the Clearbrook Police Department for systemic racial bias, a process that would change the very fabric of the institution. Officers who had turned a blind eye to discriminatory practices were held accountable, and new training protocols were established to root out bias from the ranks. For Martha and Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. While they had achieved what they set out to do, the toll that had taken on their lives was immeasurable. But there was a sense of peace that came with knowing they had fought for something bigger than themselves. The fight had been about justice for Martha, but it had transformed into a battle for dignity, equality, and a future where no one would have to endure what they had. With the court case behind them, the town of Clearbrook faced the long and difficult process of healing. The ruling had laid bare the racial tensions that had existed beneath the surface for years, tensions that many had been unwilling or unable to confront. But now, with the spotlight firmly on the town's police department and the community's reaction, there was no turning back. Town hall meetings became a regular occurrence, with people from all walks of life attending to voice their concerns, share their experiences, and discuss solutions. At first, the meetings were contentious. Long-held prejudices and frustrations bubbled to the surface, and the conversations were often heated. Some townsfolk, still angry at the police department's downfall, refused to accept the idea that the force had been corrupt. But over time, as people began to listen to each other, the tone shifted. What had started as angry debates slowly transformed into constructive dialogue. One of the most impactful meetings was when Angela, the woman who had previously spoken up about her own experiences with racial profiling, was invited to lead a discussion on equality. Her message was simple. The town needed to heal, but healing could only happen if people were willing to listen, understand, and change. As the town grappled with these hard truths, change began to take root. The police department was overhauled, new officers were brought in, and the town initiated a community policing program designed to rebuild trust between law enforcement and residents. Local schools introduced anti-bias education, and church groups began hosting forums on race, inclusion, and justice. For the first time, the town was confronting its past and actively working to create a better future. Clearbrook was no longer the same town it had been before the lawsuit. The wound was deep, but the process of healing had begun. People were learning to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. Just when the dust seemed to be settling, a surprising revelation emerged about Officer Craig. A few weeks after the trial, a local news outlet published an in-depth piece about his background. The report revealed that Officer Craig had been dealing with significant personal trauma in the years leading up to the incident with Martha. He had lost his wife to a sudden illness and had been struggling with severe depression and untreated PTSD from his time in the military. The article included interviews with former colleagues who described how Craig's behavior had changed dramatically after these personal tragedies. He had become withdrawn, irritable, and prone to anger, signs that went unnoticed by the police department, which had failed to offer him the mental health support he desperately needed. His aggression toward Martha, while inexcusable, had roots in his own unresolved pain. The news sent shockwaves through the town. Some people who had supported the lawsuit were conflicted, unsure of how to reconcile the image of Craig as both an aggressor and a man struggling with his own demons. But perhaps the most surprising reaction came from Daniel. In a public statement, Daniel acknowledged the new information and took a bold stance. "I can't forgive what Officer Craig did to my mother," Daniel said in an interview with the local news. "But I also can't ignore the fact that he was failed by the system, just like we were. He needed help, and he didn't get it. And that's part of the problem, too. Our police officers need mental health support just as much as anyone else." Daniel's words sparked a new conversation within the community about mental health, especially within law enforcement. The town council began discussing ways to provide better psychological support for officers, recognizing that unresolved trauma could lead to disastrous consequences for both officers and the public they served. Daniel's ability to extend empathy, even to the man who had wronged his family, surprised many in the community. It showed a level of compassion and leadership that went beyond the courtroom. In the end, Daniel wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for change, for a system that worked for everyone. As the months passed, both Martha and Daniel found themselves reflecting on how much their lives had changed. Martha, though still frail and scarred from the ordeal, found solace in knowing that her fight had led to something greater. She no longer felt powerless. Instead, she felt proud of what they had accomplished. The town that had once been her sanctuary had transformed into a place where real conversations about justice and equality were happening. For Daniel, the journey had been transformative. Once a quiet, reserved man who preferred to keep to himself, Daniel had emerged as a leader in the community. People looked to him for guidance, not just because he had won the lawsuit, but because he had shown grace and strength throughout the entire ordeal. He had become a voice for those who had none, an advocate for change in a system that had long been broken. In the end, both the Jenkins family and the town of Clearbrook were forever changed by what had happened. The legal victory had brought about real change, but the true victory was in the hearts and minds of the people who had learned to confront their own biases, their own complicity in a system that needed reform. As Daniel walked through town one evening, he passed by the very grocery store where the incident had first occurred. He paused, looking at the parking lot, the memories of that day still vivid in his mind. But instead of anger or sadness, he felt a sense of peace. They had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, they had helped create a better future. In the final moments of reflection, Daniel considered the journey they had been on. The fight for justice had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. Not just for him and his mother, but for everyone in the town who now had the opportunity to live in a more just and equal society. He realized that sometimes standing up for what's right means putting everything on the line. It's not an easy path, but it's a necessary one. As the story of Clearbrook's transformation came to a close, Daniel posed a question to everyone following their journey. When faced with injustice, would you have the courage to stand up, even if it meant risking everything? The question lingered in the air, inviting each person to look within themselves, to consider how they might act when their moment of truth arrived. The story wasn't just about Martha and Daniel anymore. It was about the courage to stand for justice, no matter the cost. The invitation was clear. The conversation was just beginning. Would others find the strength to join it?